Hello again, it's Andy here with another shortish video, and this is the sixth episode of my sort of journey through the genre post-rock. And up to now I've done five ones on specific bands which are sort of, to an extent, a greater or lesser extent, well-known, relatively top bands in the genre. And they went through Sigur Rós to start with, Mogwai, probably the two best known bands in this genre, followed by Mono in Japan. Then we looked at the entirely bonkers Canadian Godspeed You Black Emperor, and finished off with Explosions in the Sky from Austin, Texas. And so today I thought we'd actually have a look at where all this started, because those five bands really, they've been going sort of 20 to 25 years each of them. They're still going today, and they all sort of kicked off with their either their debut or their first key, what you might consider post-rock album in either the late 90s. Three of them came out in 97, through to around the turn of the century, 2000, 2001. So that sort of 3 or 4 year period was when all these ones started. But they weren't the first. They were, to an extent, the sort of, should we say, the mainstream. But there was an evolutionary period leading up to that, and it's quite interesting. There's some good stuff in here, including stuff which you probably know already, but didn't realise it was considered to be post-rock. So I thought I'd just go through picking five albums, which are considered to be post-rock. But when you look at it, it's really an evolutionary journey which leads up to what we now consider to be post-rock, and the style of those bands I talked about, which is essentially very guitar-based, predominantly instrumental, though there are some singing on certain bits. Particularly Mogwai use vocals more than the others maybe, and they have that sort of style of building quiet patches and very loud patches, and tend to be a bit on the heavy side, though obviously that's very variable. So I'm just going to run through this early stage. Where did all this start? Because I think there are some sort of fairly interesting stories in this, and also the very beginning is quite surprising in a way, because it's certainly something which I never considered to be post-rock until I started sort of investigating stuff a bit deeper. But they appear right at the top of many lists. You go on the internet and you can see lists of best post-rock album. They all come in slightly different order, but essentially these core ones are always at the sort of in the top 10, shall we say, or top 20. So I'm going to start off with the beginning, and it's 1988, and it's the band Talk Talk. And their album Spirit of Eden, and this, for those certainly the Brits watching this will be aware of Talk Talk, sort of historically starting out in the sort of early 80s, with being essentially a pop, sort of synth pop type band. Their early stuff really didn't do much for me, but the album before this was called Colour of Spring, came out in 86, and you could see where they were heading, but it also had there were still some elements of that sort of synth pop background, so you could see where they'd been and where they were going. So it's very much a transition album until they got to this classic, and this was truly different. I came across it way later. It was sort of like in the 80s. Had I been listening harder, I would have picked this up and really enjoyed it, because it is a truly fabulous album. To me, though, it's not really post-rock. I'm going to use an analogy on a couple of these albums of the development of prog. Because if you go back to the very beginning of prog, you go to sort of like the mid-60s, sort of late 60s, retrospectively, bands like the Moody Blues and Procol Harum maybe are sort of considered now to be early prog. I personally don't again think they are. I think that you might call them proto prog. In that sense, I would say Talk Talk and this album and the next one, which I'm going to mention next, are really proto post rock. And I think, again, in my opinion, and it's stuff I've read as well, that I think the first true prog album was considered to be King Crimson's In the Court of the Crimson King, which came out in '69. And I'm gonna come to an album which I think is the equivalent of for post rock of that. So starting out, talk. I'm rabbiting too much. They had this album and then followed it up with what to me is their best, Laughing Stock, which came out in '91. And essentially, I mean, when they produced Spirit of Eden, they were effectively sacked by their band. They threatened to be sued for not producing music which was commercial enough for them, essentially, and it isn't commercial. And if you haven't heard it, it's a must listen. They're beautiful albums, very clever. All these albums I'm going to talk about here are much more songs compared to the later stuff that I've been through before. So these aren't typically instrumental, though there are elements of that. They are typically vocal, but you can see where they're starting to head. So Talk Talk, two fabulous albums, all nearly always appear in the top 5 of best post-rock albums. As I say, I think they're more proto-post-rock. Superb as they are, it doesn't really matter what the genre is ultimately. They're brilliant albums. So '91 we got to there, and at the same time over the other side of the pond in the US was, there's no title on this, but it is the band Slint and their album Spiderland, which, as I say, came out in '91, also considered to be post rock, and it's starting to get more there. And this album is quite dark. There are sort of what I think are samples on there, call it sort of narration in elements of it, but also singing. It's dark, but it's not bleak like I was talking about Godspeed You Black Emperor, but you can start to see an influence from this on Godspeed and those bands which are slightly more dark. So it's a great album. It's not necessarily for everyone. None of these are for everyone. So this next album to me is a grail, or was a grail. So I got loads of albums on my wish lists, but I never. I probably only had this, what I would consider to be a true grail, and I found a copy of it recently and bought it, and it's probably one you've never heard of before, and it's the band called Bark Psychosis, and the album is Hex. And this has been really hard to get hold of. I mean, it was issued in '94. And I've never seen for sale even a vinyl copy of that. It was reissued in 2017 by Fire Records, fairly small run on 45, double 45 RPM sort of run, and it's incredible. I've long had a digital copy, but I found it not, quite expensive. It's relatively rare, and near mint, and bought it in the last couple of weeks. So really pleased with that. But what's that got to do with anything? Well, this to me is post rock's equivalent of in the Court of the Crimson King. If we go back to that prog analogy, so this I think is the first true post-rock album, and it sort of literally is, because the term post-rock was actually coined for Bark Psychosis. It was used as a description of them in a review of this album when it came out in '94. It was, I think it was Mojo magazine, but whatever the journalist was writing on, he referred to them as post rock, and that name has stuck, and then been tagged with all the others. So we're still singing. It's not that heavy. It's musically, it's great. I mean, they're a non-prolific band at all. That I mean, they came out with this one in '94. And then 10 years later, they came out with their next album, which is called Codename Dustsucker. I think I should have looked it up. I've got that. It's also brilliant. But to me, it really started here, and the stuff before was what you might call proto post-rock. So moving rapidly on, and then we come to '96. So we're now on the cusp of what we now consider to be true post rock and going forward. So the style that came out in the late '90s, '97, typically with Mogwai, Sigur Rós, Godspeed You Black Emperor, and then followed a few years later by Mono and Explosion in the Sky and loads of others. And this is another US band called Tortoise, another band who really resent being tagged post-rock, but it's a shame. They all do that, but that's what it is. And this album is called Millions Now Living Will Never Die. And this is one I came across a couple of years ago, rummaging in a record store, and it's not my favourite, to be honest, but it's a decent example of this genre. And again, you can start to see where it's beginning to transition. So in terms of style, it's much more closer to the proto end. But there are elements of it which are beginning to show. It's quite gentle. It's not quite heavy enough for me to really enjoy. So those are the beginnings. I've rattled through that very quickly. I think to me the key ones really in there are the Talk Talk albums. So those last two Talk Talk albums, if you don't know them, they're an absolute must to listen to, because in their own right, I think a lot of people do. They're very well known. So and Slinties as well. I think it's really different. It's quite interesting. And Bark Psychosis again is really good if you like that sort of slightly proggy, but true post rock. The first true post rock album. 1994, Bark Psychosis, Hex. I mean, good luck trying to get a vinyl copy if you want to, but I can recommend Bandcamp page. They do digital on there, so if you are open to good quality digital, you can buy for not that much a FLAC 24-bit FLAC download, which is super high quality. Anyway. There we go. That's my series on post-rock. I might at some point do a sort of follow-up, catch-up, what do they call it, honourable mentions, but not right away. I said I'd do 6, and this is the 6th. I think this sort of early stages or evolution of it is quite important to understand where it all came from and where these bands are now. As I've said many times on here, what it really is post rock. It's a sort of catch-all, but you can sort of see the connection between these bands in there and why why they're deemed that. And there you go. Thanks for listening. And if you enjoyed this, hit like or subscribe if you haven't. Thanks a lot. Cheers for now.